Okay, so where does the SCP Foundation fall on the political compass? Well, all right. First off, by elimination, they're not going to fit down here, right? These people are anomalous. They're dangerous. Goes against the whole ethos of secure, contain, protect. So because of the protect thing, you might argue that they're like right here, or possibly here, and that would make sense. But I have a somewhat different take on the SCP Foundation. So back after the election of Trump, I got involved in a Facebook group called the Zizek Dank Memes Group after Slavoj Zizek, who's a really funny guy, which is why I like him. And there's some great memes in there, and there are a lot of political compass memes, of course. And there's one political compass meme that looked at different kinds of cognition and mastery as mapping to the different mentalities. So this is more like, oh, I'm gonna like join the military and get really fit, and I'm gonna like be good at shooting. I'm gonna be good at being an engineer. And this was like, oh, I'm gonna be really good at like making money and having fun. And this is like, oh, I'm gonna be good at like, passionately helping people. This is or expressing myself creatively. And this is like, oh, I'm gonna get all the knowledge and master the science, kind of. It's like the university. So that's actually what the SCP represents. So the SCP, if anything, is not here. They're over here. Okay. So this immediately makes the SCP Foundation somewhat anomalous relative to the political status quo of existing governments, including the UN's global coalition, right? Um, but I would argue that they're actually here. They're more to the left because they have principles that are quite good. I like them, but they're somewhat left because they're not in addition to prioritizing security, they're prioritizing the preservation of these unique entities or artifacts which may be dangerous. And yeah, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, we figured out a way. We think we can neutralize this SCP." They don't always do it. They'll send it to the ethics committee. And I think the way that the O5 command works and the way that the ethics committee works, this is classic technocracy. Um, and it would make sense if some of the richest people in the world were further enhanced by various artifacts they found that make them immortal. I'm just going to drop this here. Or they make them superpowered, whatever. And they form this council and they build more capital and they build more alliances. And it would make sense that there would be like a shadow government. So there was this one SCP in the 4000 series where they get in touch with the Foundation from another universe, which is something that happens all the time in SCP stories. And in this universe, the Foundation is kind of like the TVA and Loki. So the Disney writers have been raiding SCP for ideas. They did it with WandaVerse as well. They even used the same nomenclature. Of course, it's not in violation of the license. It's their own IP. Blah blah blah. In fact, they have you'll get a license from them if you want to use their IP, right? So it's like kind of in a way very antithetical to the ethos of the copyleft. But anyway, whatever. Good shows though, and that's an interesting SCP article. And I generally am sympathetic to this view that the Foundation is kind of evil. I obviously see the good that the Foundation does, and that they're kind of at the forefront of SCP R&D, which puts them ahead of all the other groups of interest, marginally enough to create tension. Um, and so, sometimes they're up here, sometimes they're up here. Um, and it's a great allegory for the technocracy. So, technocracy is an authoritarian center left ideology where basically unelected central bankers and board members of supranational organizations that get formed by treaty that make rules that they expect other countries to follow through legislative process, but it's like, do as we say kind of a thing, like wink wink if you want to be in the club. And this is a sort of trend that we've seen in world politics that people like Alex Jones have criticized. Of course, Alex Jones is kind of off the deep end, whereas I'm not. I'm not off the deep end. I'm making political compass meme SCP videos. So I'm a pretty rational guy, relatively speaking. Um, and I also think technocracy isn't great. Well, I'm a cryptocurrency protocol designer. I made decentralized derivatives for Bitcoin and similar chains. So obviously I have a stake in that, and I'm sympathetic to these guys down here, especially Gamers Against Weed. They're my favorite. Sympathetic to these people. They're trying to get to the bottom of it. There's been a trend in the millennial and Zoomer generation where we've been using the internet to get to the bottom of evil stuff like Jeff Epstein and everyone else, and we demand justice and we demand the truth, and that's changing the world. It really is. And yeah, there's political authoritarians of different stripes coming back with after Trump. It was like, oh, what about Xi Jinping in China? Is there going to be global conflict? It's scary. There could be a nuclear war. There could be another worse pandemic, a bioengineered pandemic. There could be AIs that end the world. There could be climate apocalypse. Okay, so we're all worried about the end of the world, and the SCP setting is a really interesting sort of mythology that subverts that fear and turns it into creepypasta and soft sci-fi and sometimes hard sci-fi and sometimes mystery and sometimes horror and sometimes gothic horror and sometimes cosmic horror. It's principally a cosmic horror metaverse in which other works can be performed, and it's cool overall. So that's why I made this, because it's so fun, and that you would think, well, the SCP Foundation is good, right? And then as you really read it and you read up on the ethics committees, like fine nuanced judgments on things, you realize they're not all that ethical. And like, for example, there's an SCP that merged timelines and changed the nature of the multiverse, basically, in what you would imagine is like the canonical four frontal universe, where it's like this is like an SCP verse. This is an SCP Foundation in some part of the metaverse, some universe where the SCP Foundation is in a relatively good position, wink, wink, quote unquote. And then you have things like the Thaumiel SCPs came out of that, right? And can the Thaumiels really be trusted? SCP-2000, a really early and famous Thaumiel, is a nuclear reactor, or what kind of reactor is it? That sends you back in time, so that's pretty useful. But what if that's like the Prestige, like in that Rick and Morty episode where he thinks he's saving the game and he's really just killing himself and jumping into another universe? What if the O5s like go to this Canadian nuclear reactor, but it's actually a thaumatological reactor and it sacrifices the entire universe to create the energy in order to send them back in time by like 3 months so they can get a tactical benefit? And in their minds, they're like, well, we're navigating to the part of the multiverse where we have more tactical advantage. But it's like, yeah, at the expense of everyone in the universe. Or maybe they don't even know. Maybe they think they're just legitimately going back in time, and they don't realize that they're actually destroying the universe that they were just departing from, because Thaumiels are tricky, because that timeline merger is tricky. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the SCP Foundation has been moving further to the left, and they're getting more and more subverted by SCPs. And then there's the authoritarian aspect. There are some O5s, and this has been done in some of the SCP-1 stories, that are also evil, and then you have to kill them or whatever, right? So that's fun. That's a good subgenre as well. And then there's anti-meme SCPs that makes it all crazy, right? So, so if anything, the SCP Foundation is both a very good political allegory for the world order as it exists today, all these hidden unelected shadow governments tweaking numbers and using data to an AI to make you into a product. They're like product managers. Um, and I, obviously I resist that. So I'm something of a gamer against weed, but in cryptocurrency in the real world, where the video games are new financial systems that maybe can change the political situation. Because that's what I believe, right? So I'm like down here in the center, or maybe a little to the right, because I like the money a little more than the political idealism. Um, and I want you to make up your mind and not accept the hegemony of the Foundation. Please and thank you.